I want to take a look at a special topic. And one of the things I've always found really interesting about the Bible is how, particularly the New Testament story, but it's also true of the Old Testament, how the biblical story integrates itself with historical events. So we're not going to be looking at a specific passage. Instead, we're going to be looking at the rulers between the Testaments, and then we'll also make our way into the beginning of the New Testament to take a look at those too. But as I read the New Testament in particular, it's interesting how often the biblical writers allude to leaders. You actually get a lot of leaders named in the Gospels as well as in Acts. You get allusions to leaders even beyond that. And it's interesting because those leaders are there as kind of time markers. It places the story within the larger ancient world, within current events. And as we're going to see, those current events are actually really important for what plays out in the biblical story. But the other part that's interesting is those key leaders don't take over the biblical story. I've been working through the Gospel of Luke. If you've been watching some of those videos, Luke often names which Caesar or governor is in power, which of Herod's sons is ruling. But those characters are always there for reference, and they never become the focal point of the story. Instead, people like Zachariah and Elizabeth, or Mary and Joseph, or John the Baptist, these people become really the center point of the story instead of those political leaders. But those political leaders are there to give us context, and that context often matters. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at those leaders in the intertestamental period, so those leaders who are between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and then, as I said, we'll get into the New Testament leaders as well, particularly those leaders in the Gospels and Acts that help make that transition. A little bit of a roadmap for where we're going to go. This is a timeline that basically takes you from Alexander the Great through what is called the Herodian dynasty, or those rulers that are connected to Herod the Great. And so at the very beginning here, I have Alexander the Great's conquest, which will include the land of Israel. And then I've also included some key moments. I think the way that we're going to think about the topic is what are those key moments in history that changed the environment, and how that changed environment, that changed reality, those turning points affects the biblical story. So we'll look at Alexander the Great, his rise to power, his conquer of the Holy Land. We'll look at what's known as the Ptolemaic rule, or the Ptolemaic period, as well as the Seleucid rule, the in-between, the back and forth of those. That'll take us into really what's known as the intertestamental, the Maccabean Revolt, the Jewish revolt that leads to the Hasmonean kingdom. And then ultimately the entrance of Rome, which of course sets up the context for the New Testament, the Gospels, which will center around the Herodian rule as well as some of the Roman rule. This period, so from Alexander the Great to the Herodian period that we're looking at here, that's basically concurrent with Acts and the Gospels. You're talking about a period of history that's about 400 years. And I was trying to think of a comparison to that. So if you think about the Pilgrims landing in America in 1620, well, I'm recording this in 2025. That's about 400 years of history. So this time period we're talking about from Alexander the Great through Acts and the Gospels is about that same period of time. So enough that these kingdoms are very different. There's technological breakthroughs, there's changes in governments, but we're also not talking about thousands and thousands of years. It's a really manageable piece of history. Where we're leaving off before we jump into Alexander the Great is, if you remember the biblical story from the Old Testament ends in the period of Ezra and Nehemiah, which is basically the period in which the exiles are returning, the Jewish exiles are returning from Persia and beginning to rebuild the temple, rebuilding Jerusalem. And they're beginning to form what will be the Judaism of the New Testament. So as they're building out the land, they'll setting up many of the things that we'll see, many of the cultural aspects that will eventually lead to the conflicts with these other kingdoms and powers. So that return of the exiles from Persia to the land of Israel becomes really important for the next step. So let's get into our first turning point. As I said, I'm going to talk about these kind of as turning points to help guide our conversations. And the first major turning point between the Testaments is the conquest of Alexander the Great around 332 BC. It is obviously not just a turning point for the land of Israel, but the conquest of Alexander the Great will become a major turning point for the world as well, the known world particularly. Alexander the Great was the son of a king of Macedon, and his father had wanted to unite Greece, had wanted to conquest, but had not been able to, and Alexander takes up that vision. Historians tell us that Alexander was tutored by Aristotle, so he comes from a very Greek, Hellenized way of thinking, which will be important, and he does that. He basically, at a very young young age, unites the Greek city-states and uses that sort of combined Greek force to begin his march. In his mind, he wanted to conquer Persia. We just talked about the Jews returning from Persia. This was the great opponent to the east for Alexander the Great. And he will do it. He'll march his armies not just towards Persia, but ultimately on into bits of India, and will die at a young age, which will set up our second turning point. But I want to look at a map so you can understand why the nation of Israel becomes important in the time of Alexander the Great. So the map we're looking at here basically shows Alexander the Great's conquest through, obviously, Greece, Asia Minor. He'll go down into Egypt, then he'll move into the lands of Persia, and ultimately on into India, as I mentioned. As he sets out from Macedonia, Greece, he conquers Asia Minor. Before he can basically lead that march east towards Persia, he has to secure the land that's behind him. And one of those powers is Egypt. He can't leave his supply lines. He can't leave Macedonia and Asia Minor, where he's built cities and he's from. He can't leave that vulnerable to an attack from behind. So before he begins his conquest east, Alexander turns and moves south along the Mediterranean through what is the modern land of Israel into Egypt, where he'll conquer Egypt. And so as he's going, he is conquering these other cities, these other kingdoms. Remember, what do we have in the land of Israel at the time? We have exiles who have returned. So they are still under Persian rule, but they're under the rule of governors like Nehemiah. So these Jewish rulers who are overseeing the Jews in the land under the rule of Persia. One of the things I want to point out here is that the way that Alexander moves south through the land of Judea, through the land of modern Israel, this is going to be an important route because it connects several of these great powers. If you look on the map, you can see what will eventually be Greece and will become Rome. Asia Minor is connected to Persia to the east, is connected to Egypt to the south. Nobody wants to go through this, the Arabian desert, the wilderness. So this strip of land along the Mediterranean, particularly there is a strip of coastland along the Mediterranean that was a major highway in the ancient world and that would have been more accessible. It would have had more sources to water, flat land for chariots and troops. So this path along the Mediterranean becomes a really important route. And it's why, as we'll see in later history, the modern land of Israel becomes so contested by all of these world powers over this period of time. And that's certainly the case for Alexander as well. So how did Alexander conquer the land? Well, Josephus actually writes about this. I've quoted Josephus in previous videos. He is a first century Jewish historian who basically sides with Rome during the Great Revolt and writes a Jewish history, but it also includes a sort of for a Roman audience. But he talks a lot about this event in which Alexander the Great made his way through the land of Judea. And if I come back to the map for a moment, it centers around, you'll notice here, you have Gaza and just to the north, Tyre. Tyre becomes one of the important battles or sieges for Alexander the Great, and it ties in to the story of the Jews in Judea. So Josephus writes this: Jadus the high priest was in agony. So this is the high priest serving in the temple in Jerusalem. Jadus was in agony and under terror, as not knowing how he should meet the Macedonians, this is the army of Alexander the Great, since the king was displeased at his foregoing disobedience. Now, this disobedience that Jadus is concerned about is whenever Alexander the Great laid siege to Tyre, he sent special requests to all of the kingdoms around for support. He wanted them to aid in supplies and material and food, probably troops as well. And Josephus tells us that the Samaritans immediately left their Persian loyalties and joined Alexander the Great and provided that. But Jerusalem and Judea refused support to Alexander the Great in his siege against Tyre. And so Jadus is now concerned that should Alexander the Great succeed in his siege of Tyre, of course he's next going to turn on Jerusalem, and ultimately he's going to oppose Jerusalem and the Jews because of their Persian support. So this is the fear that Jadus the high priest is dealing with. God warned him in a dream, this is Jadus, which came upon him after he had offered sacrifice, that he should take courage and adorn the city and open the gates, so don't put up a resistance, open the gates, that the rest should appear in white garments, but that he and the priest should meet the king in the habits proper to their order, without the dread of any ill consequence, which the providence of God would prevent. And when Jadus understood that Alexander was not far from the city, he went out in procession with the priests and the multitude of citizens. It's a really interesting approach. So Alexander does take Tyre. He does turn and march his army on Jerusalem. And so Jadus, the high priest, in all of the highest priestly adornments, his garments, and all of the other people in white, basically open the gates to the city. They're welcoming Alexander. And this is kind of a classic ancient move, that whenever a king would return to his city, or whenever a ruler would come into the city, the prominent people of the city would go out and meet that coming general or king and welcome them in a procession into the city. So they're basically welcoming Alexander the Great, even though, remember, they've just denied support to Alexander the Great. Josephus gets into the rest of that story. When Alexander sees Jadus dressed in the robes of the high priest, Josephus talks about the turban he was wearing that was adorned with the gold-plated engraving of the Hebrew name for God. He approached by himself, Josephus says, adoring that name, and first saluted the high priest. So he seems to welcome him. And then apparently the high priest began to offer prophecies about the coming of the Macedonian king Alexander the Great. So Josephus records, and when the book of Daniel was showed him, so the priest opens the book of Daniel and begins to read to Alexander the Great from Daniel, and wherein Daniel declared that one of the Greeks should destroy the empire of the Persians, he supposed that himself was the person intended, and as he was then glad, he dismissed the multitude for the present. So the passage that specifically the priest reads is from Daniel 8. The two-horned ram that you saw stands for the kings of Media and Persia. The hairy male goat stands for the king of Greece, and the great horn that was between its eyes stands for its first king. So the priest reads this prophecy from Daniel. Alexander takes it that it is about him, and he interprets it as the Jews are giving him a prophecy of victory over the Persians. And this wins over his affections, and he spares Jerusalem. It's at that point that he basically takes control of the city, and for all intents and purposes, Judea falls under the rule of Alexander the Great. Now, that brings us to our next turning point, which will be the death of Alexander the Great, which is a really significant event in world history. In many ways, the death of Alexander the Great was as significant as the conquest of Alexander the Great, and for a particular reason. Alexander died in 323 BC, which meant he was only around 33 years old. There's mystery surrounding his death. He died in the far reaches of his kingdom, still on the conquest, still very much leading his army in the field. And when he dies, he does not leave a succession plan. He does not name somebody who should take over his kingdom, which this kingdom, remember now, stretches from Greece to Egypt, all the way to the land of India. All of this land, all of these armies that are in the field, all of a sudden find themselves without a ruler, without a leader. And so what inevitably happens is all of Alexander the Great's generals begin warring against one another. They each begin claiming land, claiming rights to rule. The map that I'm showing you is a breakdown of eventually how those lands became distributed amongst either various local governments. In the case of Greece, the city-states began to exert rule again, or the prominent generals that took over parts of land, or the kings that they ruled over that were local kings. There's a lot of history here, a lot of back and forth, but I'm just trying to give you an overview that focuses on its impact to the biblical story. So the two kingdoms that really matter the most here are the Seleucid kingdom and the Ptolemaic kingdom. And so those are made up in this map of blue for the Ptolemaic territory and in purple for the Seleucid territory. These are both Seleucus and Ptolemy are both generals under Alexander the Great who take control of these two pieces of land. And what you're going to notice that the Ptolemaic territory is basically what was Egypt, with Alexandria as its capital, named after Alexander the Great. And then you basically have in Antioch, what is most of the Persian territory, you have the Seleucid kingdom. But what do you have between the two? You have, again, on the map, this small strip of land along the Mediterranean where the Jews find themselves living in Judea. Now, under the rule of Alexander the Great, and then ultimately will be under the rule first of the Ptolemaic, the Egyptian kingdom, and then under the rule, as it wars back and forth between these two generals, ultimately the Seleucid kingdom. And that'll become a really important point. But a little bit about these two generals and the kingdoms that they found, or the rule that they led, because they had very different approaches. So in this photo, what I have what are busts of the two great kings, Ptolemy on the left and Seleucus on the right. Originally, the Jewish people fell under the rule of Ptolemy. And what's really interesting here, if I showed you this picture of Ptolemy on the left, you would say he's an Egyptian. He looks Egyptian, he's dressed Egyptian. What's interesting is he's actually a Greek general under the rule of Alexander. But the Ptolemaic rulers had a unique approach to dealing with culture and religion and their people. They basically, Egypt was a very, very old empire, even at the time of being conquered by Alexander the Great, and one that had a rich and long culture as well as religion. And so Ptolemy's and then his dynasty that he founds basically adopt Egyptian culture. They begin to dress like Egyptian pharaohs. They incorporate Egyptian gods and religion and festivals. And so they're generally open to allowing the local conquered people to practice their normal customs, to practice their normal religion, so long as it's done within peace for them as rulers and ultimately their sort of Greek philosophy. And so you have Ptolemy very much presenting himself as a pharaoh, as an Egyptian. Now, on the right, you have Seleucus. Interestingly enough, this bust of Ptolemy's is an original. The Seleucus one is a remake, but he looks very much, as you would imagine, a Greek general. He presents himself as a great Greek hero. And Seleucus had a very different approach. He was a strong voice for what is known as Hellenization. Hellenization is the spreading of Greek culture. As Alexander the Great began to conquer kingdoms, he Hellenized those kingdoms. He began to teach Greek. He began to spread Greek philosophy and Greek gods. And many of these cities, he basically founded in Alexandria everywhere he went. But many of these cities that he conquered became structured around Greek culture, around Greek politics, around Greek philosophy. And Seleucus was one of the leaders who believed strongly in all of the local populations should become Hellenized. They should learn Greek. They should practice Greek culture. They should set up Greek games and Greek amphitheaters and Greek gymnasiums and Greek baths. And so you see eventually when Seleucus has control, as we'll look at in a moment, he becomes more of a force of assimilation into that Greek culture. Now, Israel will find itself caught between these two kingdoms. At first, being ruled by the Ptolemaic kingdom and that sort of open willingness for them to continue practicing Jewish customs. But eventually, the Seleucid king Antiochus III will invade Judea. He will finally drive out in 200 BC the Ptolemaic kingdom, and the Seleucids will take control. And that'll be really important as we look at some of the forced Hellenization of the Jewish people. There is one Greek scholar that I want to point out, and the point I'm making here is the Greeks had a really hard time understanding the Jewish people because they only had one God. Even when I talk about the general openness of the Ptolemaic kings to incorporate other gods, in some ways that was easy for them to do because every land had a god, and so they either associated them with Greek gods or they just welcomed them into this broader world of multiple gods. The Seleucid kingdom was even willing to do that so far as the Greek gods and Greek culture was given priority. But the Jews are a really difficult thing for the Greeks to understand because the Jews are one of the only monotheistic religions in the ancient world. That they only had one God, and it wasn't that they only worshipped one God, they only believed one God existed, which was a really hard concept for the Greeks. And the Greeks saw it as a kind of threat. And so you get this from even Greek historians. So this is a Greek historian talking about the uniqueness of the Jewish people. He's describing their temple. There is no image, nor statue, nor votive offerings therein. Nothing at all is planted there. Neither grove, nor anything of the sort. He's talking about like sacred trees. The priests abide therein both day and night, performing certain purification rites and drinking not the least drop of wine, which shocks him, while they are in the temple. This is a Greek historian basically trying to understand the perplexities of Jewish worship and Jewish identity and Jewish culture. And this will form the big issue that will lead us into the next turning point. The next rule is basically you cannot fully reconcile Greek culture and Greek religious ideas with the Jewish idea of monotheism and Jewish history. We need to look at a really important ruler of the Seleucid kingdom. So this is Antiochus IV Epiphanes. He's in the line of Seleucus, but we're a little bit of time later. Between the periods of 170 and 167 AD, this Seleucid king Antiochus IV Epiphanes gets very serious about forced Hellenization. They had been doing Hellenization. They had been spreading Greek culture even amongst the Jews. And it's probably a fair point to make, because we'll see this in a moment as well. Some of the Jews adopted that Hellenization, that Greek culture, willingly. So you have tensions even within the Jewish people about how much to give in to that Greek culture. Obviously, if you learn the Greek language and you begin to practice Greek culture, it opens up business opportunities, social opportunities. So there's tension even within Judaism. But with Antiochus IV, you basically get the decision that there needs to be stronger enforcement of Hellenization because the Jews were not assimilating the way that he would have liked. So the book of Maccabees tells the story. It's an intertestamental book, so it's not in most Christian Bibles, although I believe it is in the Catholic Bibles. But it tells the story of this intertestamental period, and particularly the rule of Seleucid kings like Antiochus IV and the Jewish rebellion against them. And so we read this about Antiochus IV from 2 Maccabees. When these happenings were reported to the king, he's basically alluding to an event in which Antiochus IV left and went south. And while he was in the south, rumors began to spread that he had been killed in battle. And hearing this news that he had been killed, the Jews basically began a revolt. They began to seize control. Well, Antiochus IV had not died in battle. And when he found out that the Jews in Jerusalem were in rebellion, he came back upset, and he came back with a plan to force Hellenization even more strongly. So that's what 2 Maccabees is referring to. When these things were reported to the king, he thought that Judea was in revolt. Raging like a wild animal, he set out from Egypt and took Jerusalem by storm. He ordered his soldiers to cut down without mercy those who they met and to slay those who took refuge in their houses. There was a massacre of young and old, a killing of women and children, a slaughter of virgins and infants. In the space of 3 days, 80,000 were lost, 40,000 meeting a violent death, and the same number being sold into slavery. From this point on, the Seleucid kings take a more active and controlled approach to forcing Hellenization. There are other places in the book of Maccabees where it alludes to this. So, for instance, there's another portion of Maccabees that reads, "Not long after this, the king sent an Athenian senator to compel the Jews to forsake the laws of their fathers and to cease living by the laws of God, and also to pollute the temple in Jerusalem and to call it the temple of the Olympian Zeus." There's some pretty tragic stories that begin to spread about this period. So the Seleucid kings outlaw the Sabbath and the practice of Jewish festivals. They also outlaw the reading of Torah within homes. They begin sacrifices that were considered blasphemous. There's recordings of pigs being sacrificed within Jerusalem. And then one of the strongest is he actually outlaws circumcision. And if he finds infants who have been circumcised, there's a capital punishment. There's a story that spreads from this period about a mother having circumcised 2 twin boys, and the Seleucids catching them, executing the infants, and then tying them on a rope around her neck and making her walk through Jerusalem. So there becomes immense hostility between the Seleucid kings and the Jews around these issues of the Seleucid kings trying to end the practice of Judaism and force Hellenization. And that's much of the story of the book of Maccabees. There's a modern Jewish historian, Rabbi Burrell, who summarizes this period this way. I think it's helpful. He writes, "Women who allowed their sons to be circumcised were killed with their sons tied around their necks," what I was alluded to. "The scholars of Israel were hounded, hunted down, and killed. Jews who refused to eat pork or sacrifice hogs were tortured to death. Even the smallest hamlet in Judah was not safe from the oppression of the Hellenists. The altars to Zeus and other pagan deities were erected, and Jews of every area were forced to participate in these sacrificial services." It becomes a huge issue, as you could imagine, and it's going to lead us into what is one of the next turning points we want to take a look at. The Jews could only put up with this so long before there would be rebellion, and of course there was. And the rebellion that ultimately succeeded was begun in 167, known as the Maccabean Revolt. The Maccabean Revolt is another one of our major turning points we want to look at, because the rulers over the Jews will change, and again, it'll have an impact on its culture. The story goes that there was a rural priest whose name was Mattathias, and he was in one of these situations in which he and his family were being forced to make a sacrifice. One of the Greek rulers had showed up in their town and set up an altar, and they were demanding as a sign of loyalty that the Jews participate in a Greek sacrifice. And he, as a priest, is obviously, and a devout Jew, opposed to it. But people in the city began to step forward. There's a man who is willing to make the sacrifice. And so as he goes near to the altar, Mattathias steps forward and kills both the Jew who is about to make the sacrifice and the Greek officer who is presiding over that sacrifice. And at that point, Mattathias and his 5 sons flee into the mountains and began gathering revolutionary fighters to oppose the Greeks. That grows into what will become a full-fledged revolt against the Greeks. And Mattathias dies fairly quickly within that revolt, and his son Judas Maccabeus takes over. Judas Maccabeus is a nickname that literally means the hammer. So he becomes this sort of force against forced Hellenization and begins leading this Maccabean revolt. The Maccabean Revolt is not an army, so this is a revolutionary kind of fight, and they use primarily guerrilla tactics. But it is more than just loyal Jews stepping up and fighting these hostile Greeks. In many ways, you can think about the Maccabean Revolt as also a civil war, because you have these devout Jews. I mean, this is in the story of Mattathias slaying not only the Greek officer, but also the Jew that was stepping forward to make the pagan sacrifice. The Maccabean Revolt is really about devout Jews trying to drive out both the Greeks and those Jews who had sided with the Greeks and begun to pollute and abandon the Jewish faith. And so this will become a major force within the land, driving out Greeks, but also those Jews. And eventually it becomes successful. So in 164, you have the death of Antiochus IV while he's in Persia. In this moment of destabilization, the Maccabeans, who have mostly been leading the rebellion outside of Jerusalem, they now seize Jerusalem, the city itself, and set themselves up as Jewish rulers in the sovereign state of Judea, which is the first time this has happened since all the way back when Jerusalem was under siege and ultimately destroyed by the Babylonians in the Old Testament. So it is a remarkable moment in Jewish history, because for the first time in a long time since the Old Testament, you have a Jewish ruler sovereignly in control of Jerusalem. We need to look at what plays out in this seizing of Jerusalem, but also the line of the Maccabean kings, because it's an interesting story. One of the references that I think will be familiar to you is if you obviously are aware of Jews still celebrating Hanukkah. Although it's interesting, most Christians do not celebrate Hanukkah. And if you've ever wondered where Hanukkah comes from, it's in this story. And there actually is a New Testament allusion to it. So the celebration of Hanukkah looks at that moment in which the Maccabeans seized Jerusalem for the first time. Having seized Jerusalem, they purified the temple and began the proper sacrifices and worship. But one of the challenges they had was, as they began to light the lamps in the temple, there was certain kinds of sacred oil that was to be used, a process for producing that oil. And there was not enough oil to keep those lamps burning until more oil could be produced as it was supposed to. And so the celebration of Hanukkah takes its image of the lighting of candles from the fact that that small amount of oil miraculously extended until new oil could be produced. And so Hanukkah is a celebration of that light, that miracle, but also of the Hasmonean kingdom, the Maccabean Revolt, and its taking over of Jerusalem. And I put a reference here to John 10 because you actually get a mention of Hanukkah, though it doesn't show up that way in our translations, in that fact that Jesus was going to Jerusalem, as probably all of the New Testament Jews would have done, to think or to celebrate even in their homes this historic moment. So in John chapter 10 we read, "Then came the festival of dedication." That is the Hebrew word Hanukkah. So then came the festival of Hanukkah at Jerusalem. It was winter and Jesus was in the temple courts walking in Solomon's colonnade. The Jews who were there gathered around him saying, "How long will you keep us in suspense? If you are the Messiah, tell us plainly." So Jesus is actually going up to Jerusalem during the festival of Hanukkah. So there is actually a reference to Hanukkah in the New Testament, which, I don't know, maybe an interesting trivia note for you. The Hasmoneans began, now that they are ruling over Jerusalem, to expand their control around the land. And initially, that control is focused on the land that was actually Jewish, so Judea itself. But then it begins to spread. They began under the succession of their rulers in the period of time to capture other areas. So in 110 BC, they capture Samaria. They go on to capture the region of Galilee. And then they do something even beyond that. They began to conquer non-Jewish lands, so particularly the Idumeans, This is going to become important for us in a moment when we get to the Herodian dynasty. But as they conquer these non-Jewish people, the Hasmoneans, those descendants of the Maccabean Revolt, they actually begin their own sort of forced assimilation. As in the case of the Idumeans, they'll actually have them forcefully converted to Judaism, to include forcefully circumcised. And these Idumeans and these other people that they began to capture become Jewish through conquest, through the conquering of their lands. And again, I point this out because this is going to become really important when we get to the Herods, because they tie themselves back into these Idumeans. But the bigger point I want you to see from the map is this becomes a real empire. The Jews are taking land, they're acquiring land, they're developing armies, they're building out wealth. And during this period, this intertestamental period, there is a sovereign nation of Judea that is spreading and being led by Jewish leaders. You don't have to memorize this. This is not going to be critically important, but there are a couple of things. What you're looking at here is basically the secession of these Maccabeans, what are known as the Hasmonean kingdom. And at the very top, you notice we have Mattathias. This is the priest who led the initial revolt. And I point out that he was a priest because, again, this is going to be important as well, too. Then you have beneath his 5 sons, and then it begins to track some of these rules. John Hyrcanus, and then you get down to ultimately 2 brothers that I want us to look at. It's in this 4th lineage, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II. Maybe a couple things you should begin to note. It's interesting as you keep going down the list that we start getting names like Alexander that show up. Alexander, as you've probably learned from our history so far, is not a Jewish name. Why do we have Alexandrias? Because of Alexander the Great. So even though these Hasmoneans rebelled against Hellenized culture, as they come to power, as they begin to build an empire, they actually begin to take on Hellenized names, and they become unbelievably wealthy in their positions. Now, they are a dynasty of priests. Mattathias from the very beginning was a priest. His sons are priests. They track themselves as priests. But something unique happens with Aristobulus I. Aristobulus I takes not only the title of priest, high priest, but he also names himself a king. Now, there's a question about this, because if you remember your Old Testament history, no high priest is supposed to be a king, and no king is supposed to be a high priest. The kings find themselves in the lineage of David through the tribe of Judah. The priests find themselves in the lineage of Aaron. And so, number one, they should never become the same because they're from different family lines. But number two, the Old Testament forbids one person holding this position as a kind of ancient check on power. I mean, if you think about the roles of the priests and the prophets and how they stood up to the kings, particularly in their corruption, this is the way God had designed that system. But during the Hasmonean kingdom, because they're priests, but they're ruling as high priests, Aristobulus I finally throws out this restriction and names himself priest and king. And it's a question from many of the devout Jews who know the law. There's concern about the fact that these priests are now putting themselves not only in positions of wealth, not only taking on Hellenized culture, but now really violating the law to attain this power of the king themselves. The real crisis will come, though, as I mentioned, in this 4th line between the 2 brothers, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, both the second, as they will ultimately find themselves in civil war with one another. And it's also going to lead us to what will become the important turning point during this period. A civil war breaks out between these 2 brothers, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus I. Hyrcanus was named high priest, and then, as well as Aristobulus I, took the title of king. And in response to that, Aristobulus II rebels against his brother. And there's a series of wars that play out, the largest of them being the battle at Jericho, where Hyrcanus was ultimately defeated and forced to renounce the throne as king. But we find ourselves in a real destabilized moment in which these 2 brothers are dividing the people, dividing loyalties, as well as probably other Jews who are concerned about the whole line of Hasmoneans. And they do something really interesting in this moment. They actually appeal to Rome, who has a growing influence. We've not talked about Rome yet, but Rome is beginning to grow in through the Greek city-states and then on into Asia Minor into what is Syria to the north of Judea. And so the Romans are beginning to show force and power in the region, and these two warring brothers will ultimately make an appeal to Rome to help settle the dispute. It'll lead us to our next turning point. But there's also another key individual here that emerges from this period of civil war, and that is Antipater, who is an Idumean. I talked a few minutes ago about the Idumeans were a kingdom to the south of Judea, and during the Hasmonean rule, they began to conquer people like the Idumeans and force them into a conversion. And that's what happened with ultimately the great-grandfather of Antipater. Antipater is an Idumean, not a Jew by birth, but through the conquest that led to them becoming Jewish. And Antipater leads an Idumean army as a kind of mercenary. And he finds himself caught up in the middle of this civil war as he becomes a kind of political advisor as well as a military leader who is helping Hyrcanus during this revolution that's taking place, during this civil war that's taking place. So Hyrcanus had this Idumean mercenary, Antipater, who's helping fight, but also serving as a kind of political advisor. When Hyrcanus, remember, who's just been driven out by his brother Aristobulus II, he feels himself to be the rightful ruler. So he goes to the Romans who are in Syria to appeal. And he goes with this Idumean Antipater as his visor. Ultimately, Aristobulus will follow him. And so both of these brothers will find themselves before an important Roman figure, Pompey, the general, who's in Syria at the time. And Pompey will attempt to negotiate or side with these two brothers who are warring together. What will happen, and the reason I've named this important turning point, the rise of Antipater, is really neither brother will come out on top. And the end of this story will ultimately lead to the rise in power of Antipater, the Idumean, as Pompey will recognize him as the real potential for leadership. But the other thing that'll be interesting is this is the moment in which Rome begins to flex its control and then ultimately take control of Jerusalem and Judea. And we'll go through the story in a moment, but I think as we do, an important thing to note is Pompey will eventually seize Jerusalem. He will capture the city and take control for Rome. But the original opportunity for Rome came not simply because his generals saw it and wanted it, but the independently ruling Jews, its civil war between two brothers, will actually go and ask for Roman intervention to settle this dispute between the two brothers. So really, Jerusalem, the rule of the Hasmoneans, crack the door open to Roman influence and ultimately Roman control because of their own civil war. I think it's a really sad moment within their history, and it has pretty devastating consequences. So let's talk about this turning point, the rise of Antipater. Antipater helps raise a Nabatean mercenary army to help Hyrcanus fight and take back control. But while they're in Rome, making their appeal to Pompey in Syria, both Hyrcanus and Aristobulus request Rome's help through bribes. And Pompey is not impressed with either of these brothers. He's particularly not impressed with Hyrcanus, who he thinks is a weak and not a capable leader. But if you imagine Pompey, who is a shrewd, will ultimately be a leader of Rome, a shrewd leader himself, he recognizes that perhaps a weak leader in Jerusalem with somebody that he can use for Rome's continued influence might be better than a strong leader. And so he ultimately aligns himself with Hyrcanus. But really, he begins to build a relationship with Antipater, this Idumean advisor, because he realizes Antipater has the actual influence and power, the mind to be able to lead. Pompey makes a decision settling with Hyrcanus, but ultimately Pompey will have to enforce this decision. He himself will march on Jerusalem. And in 63 BC, Judea becomes a state, a client state of Rome, as Pompey lays siege to and captures Jerusalem. Now, many of the Jews, like Hyrcanus, probably imagined that this was Roman intervention to secure his throne. But of course, what happens is it becomes a Roman client state. Rome is actually, in many ways, invited in. And immediately, Pompey begins to flex that control. Aristobulus II is arrested and taken to Rome as a political prisoner, so that brother is removed from the situation. And Judea is set up as a kind of client state in which basically there will now be taxation, there will be Roman policy. There are some important things taking place in the Roman world that are also probably important for us to catch up on, because Rome is not just conquering places like Asia Minor and Jerusalem. They actually find themselves themselves in the middle of a period of civil war. If you remember the story from ancient history, Julius Caesar had crossed the Rubicon. He had marched his troops, his legions, on Rome itself, and he had pitted himself against Pompey, who was recalled by Rome to try to oppose Julius Caesar. In Egypt, civil war is also breaking out between Ptolemies, one of the Ptolemaic kings, and the sister of that Ptolemaic king, Cleopatra, who's ultimately going to align herself with Rome, just like we talked about in Jerusalem, to try to take control of Egypt. So you have this moment of destabilization in Rome, in Egypt, within the land of Israel. As this civil war plays out, Pompey is defeated by Julius Caesar, and he flees to Egypt. But as he comes, the Ptolemaic kings have Pompey executed. He's killed there. Now, this may seem strange to us, but Julius Caesar is furious that the Ptolemaic rulers have killed Pompey, even though Pompey's his enemy. He's upset because in the Roman mind, as a Roman general, even though he was defeated, he had some value as a Roman himself and perhaps should have been arrested. But if it had ultimately come to execution, that was Julius Caesar's decision. So Julius Caesar actually sides with Cleopatra at this point against the Ptolemaic rulers and begins to support Cleopatra and her seizing control of Egypt, again, in alignment with Rome. That particular civil war between Cleopatra and the Ptolemaic kings becomes a full-out war in which armies are being moved around and brought into place, and Cleopatra is outnumbered. She finds herself in a difficult position. So guess who comes to the rescue of Cleopatra in this moment? A Idumean mercenary named Antipater. So remember, Antipater is our one who's been supporting Hyrcanus, that Pompey has recognized as a prominent leader. So he comes to Cleopatra's rescue and helps Cleopatra overthrow the Ptolemaic kingdom and seize control of Egypt, which aligns him now with Cleopatra as well as Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar, in reward for Antipater rescuing Cleopatra and playing a pivotal role in that civil war, he actually gives Antipater the right to rule over Judea. He is the one who makes Hyrcanus high priest, and he is the one that makes Antipater the effective ruler, naming him a Roman citizen and giving him the right to rule. Now, Antipater will not take the title of king. I think he understands well enough to know that he's ruling over Judeans as an Idumean. So the Jews will not accept him as a Jewish king. So he becomes a kind of governor over the land of Judea. But at this moment, we no longer have Hasmoneans from the Maccabean Revolt, Jews, ruling over. We now have a Roman client, a governor, an Idumean, who is part Jewish, but through forced conversion, who has been named by Julius Caesar to rule over the region. And in many ways, this is the moment that Rome, having been conquered Jerusalem through Pompey, and now having given it over to this client leader under Antipater, this is the moment Rome has come to take control of the land of Israel. So this is our turning point, Antipater. And then we have to look at Antipater's sons, because this will finally move us into the period between what has been the intertestamental period into what is now the actual history of the New Testament itself. That turning point in 43 BC, Herod's sons, two of them, Phasael and Herod. In 43 BC, Herod will ultimately become its ruler. But we need to look at the story that plays out. Phasael was originally named the governor of Judea, and Herod, this is the Herod the Great we know from the New Testament Gospels, although we're not quite to that period. Herod the Great was named the governor of Galilee. Now, Phasael, his brother, was said to be wise and diplomatic, a strategist when it came to politics. And the way that Herod is depicted in ancient history is that he was younger, he was more athletic, he was apparently handsome and famed for his horsemanship, his abilities in battle, his fearlessness and ambition. There's some great stories about how Herod, when he was leading his troops, used to hold wrestling matches within the camps for entertainment. So you could basically wrestle the commanding officer, the general, although you get the indication that Herod always won, but partly because he was so athletic. So you have these two brothers who are ruling side by side, Judea and Galilee, who are both the sons of Antipater, who's been named a governor by Rome. Antipater's sons, Phasael and Herod. Now, what will happen here is not a civil war, but a different kind of tragedy. You have a new period of chaos that erupts around Rome, and it becomes a challenge for these rulers who have been named by those previous powers. Once again, let's reach back into our ancient history. If you took a class perhaps in college, what happens to Julius Caesar? Julius Caesar is assassinated. What happens to Antipater? Remember, who's aligned himself with Cleopatra and Julius Caesar. Antipater is also assassinated. You have a new Roman who comes to power named Mark Antony. And anytime you have new leaders that come to power, what inevitably happens is the previous governors that have been ruling are now either thrown out of office or have to find a way to endear themselves to the new leader. I mean, think about it in our own government, right? If we elect a new president, what happens? All the cabinet positions are changed. All of the sort of governmental offices are named with new heads. Well, that happens all over the Roman Empire when Mark Antony comes to power. And it also is seen as an opportunity for want-to-be rulers or people who think they should be ruling to try to make that case. And that happens. Do you remember Aristobulus? We got to go back just a little bit. Remember, there were the two Hasmonean brothers that were warring with each other in civil war. You had Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. When Rome invaded Jerusalem, they sent Aristobulus as a political prisoner to Rome. Now, Aristobulus ultimately died in Rome, but he had children. In fact, one of his sons was Antigonus II Mattathias. Mattathias, he's Hasmonean. Remember, he traces himself back to the Maccabean Revolt. We'll just call him Antigonus for our case. Antigonus became extremely anti-Rome, partly because of what had happened to his father. And so during the period of Mark Antony's rule, he actually fled Rome and went to the Parthians, which I've got on the map. The Parthians are to the far, the old Persian kingdom, the far right on the map, the far east of the Roman territory. And they were a threat to the Roman Empire, particularly on the edges of its border. And Antigonus basically bribed the Parthians to send him back to Judea and make him king, to take the land of Judea from the Romans. And it worked. The Parthians helped him raise an army, and he began to march on Jerusalem to reclaim it as a Hasmonean with the Parthian support against Rome. Word of this began to spread, and so Phasael, remember the two sons, Herod the Great and Phasael. Phasael was sent with Hyrcanus. Hyrcanus was one of the two original brothers. Remember, I said Aristobulus died in Rome. Hyrcanus continued to be high priest, and this is now his nephew, Antigonus, who is rebelling against and coming with the Parthians. So Phasael is sent with Hyrcanus to try to negotiate peace with the Parthians. What they didn't realize is it was a kind of trap. As they arrived, they met together, and Antigonus stepped forward to his uncle, Hyrcanus. And as they greeted one another, there's different accounts, but Josephus says that Antigonus bit off Hyrcanus's ear. Now, that seems like a really strange thing, kind of a Mike Tyson moment. But remember, Hyrcanus had been serving as high priest, and the idea of the high priest was that you couldn't have any physical blemishes that would disqualify you from the priesthood. So by biting off his ear, Antigonus basically disqualifies his uncle Hyrcanus for rule. So it's an insult, but it also is to delegitimate his power. And then the other thing that happens, and there's mixed reports on how, but somehow during the negotiations, Phasael, Herod the Great's brother, Herod's brother, is killed. He does not return home from the negotiations. And now, so you have Hyrcanus removed from priesthood, Phasael removed from his ruling position, and the Parthian army with Antigonus continues to advance on Jerusalem. Ultimately, Herod the Great will flee. He finds himself in a really vulnerable position, and he flees to Rome, which will be important. And for a very short period of time, Antigonus actually reclaims the throne of Jerusalem and the high priesthood as a Hasmonean. And ultimately, Herod will put together a plan to retake it. But for a brief moment of time, this plan actually works to reestablish the Parthians, push Rome out, and recapture it as a Hasmonean kingdom. Herod the Great leaves Galilee, leaves Jerusalem, and makes his way to Rome. He meets with Octavian. He will be Caesar Augustus, as his ancient history records. And he also, Herod the Great, meets with the Roman Senate to raise this army. And they confirm him not just as a governor. This is going to be important. The Roman Senate confirms Herod as king of the Jews. They move his title up. And where his father, Antipater, was unwilling to take the title, Herod the Great seems more than willing to take the title. So he takes the title title of king, raises a Roman army, and he returns first to Galilee and then to Judea, and he begins to lead a military conquest to recapture the land of the Jews, the rightful rule where his father had been, with Roman support, to drive out both Aristobulus and the Parthians, which he succeeds in doing. And that leads us to, of course, the period of the New Testament and our next turning point. Herod is named king of Judea. And of course, we find our first reference in the Bible, Luke chapter 1, in the time of Herod, king of Judea. I mean, this is the moment in which the New Testament story finds its immediate context, Rome with Herod. Now, we could stop there. We've basically covered the period of history, this intertestamental period that takes us from the return from exile, Ezra and Nehemiah, to the opening of the New Testament, Herod the Great. But I thought it might be helpful to just continue for a moment the Herodian dynasty. What Herod the Great will found is this Herodian dynasty. And I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but there are more than one Herod that shows up in the Bible. And what often happens is they will just say Herod was ruling. And you may not realize that these are different Herods in different regions and different time periods throughout the New Testament. And so it might be helpful just for your New Testament reading if we push our timeline just a little further and look at some of the Herods that are ruling. A quick word on Herod the Great. Herod the Great becomes massively important for ancient Israel in the first century. In fact, if you go to Israel today, many of the things you will see and tour are the direct consequence of Herod. Herod was known as a master builder. So he does several things. He builds a new city, which is called Caesarea Maritima. He literally carves a city off of the beach, builds a break wall. It becomes one of the great port cities of the ancient world. He builds a massive palace in Jerusalem. He begins building fortresses around the land. Herodium, which is literally a mountain that he builds with a fortress on top. Masada, one of the great places along the Dead Sea. There'll later on be a group of Jewish revolutionaries that will die there. But he builds it initially as a luxurious palace. He builds a palace at Jericho. But the thing he's probably most known for is his massive expansion of the temple. The temple that Jesus comes to is one that had been largely expanded and improved by Herod the Great. And he had done that because, and this is important to remember about Herod, because he's a complex figure even in the Gospels. Who is Herod? Herod is the descendant of an Idumean. Remember, his father, Antipater, an Idumean. He was Jewish because of the conquest of the Idumeans, but he was not a part of the Hasmonean dynasty. And there are still many Jews in the land who feel like the ruler should be a descendant of David, and a high priest should be the descendant of Aaron, and this Idumean who is ruling over them. As much as he wants to build the temple, as much as he wants to present himself as a Jew, which, to be honest, sometimes he presented himself as a Jew, but when it was convenient, he presented himself as very Roman to the Romans. So there are many Jews who question the legitimacy of Herod, and Herod knows this. So he's often doing things like building the temple in impressive ways to try to win over that Jewish support. We also know that Herod was somewhat of a mad figure. We get images of this in the New Testament. So, of course, the famous scene from Matthew. Then Herod, this is Herod the Great, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he sent and killed all of the male children in Bethlehem and in all of the region. You get a sense from the biblical story that there are moments where Herod sort of loses himself into madness and rage. But the ancient historians, Josephus in particular, gives us many more images of that. Herod would marry several times. But probably, and I'll let you do your own reading on it, the wife that he loved most and seems to have obsessed over his entire life was named Mariamne, who he married because she was a Hasmonean princess. She was in the line of the rulers of the Hasmonean kingdom. And he seems to have first married her because he's trying to, again, he's trying to legitimate his rule. He's trying to say that not only is he legitimately Jewish, but he's married to a Hasmonean princess. Therefore, their sons would be legitimate royalty in that line. It's a kind of political marriage. But he seems to have fallen for her and really loved her in somewhat obsessive ways. But he also became nervous that not only was she having an affair, but that those affairs were leading to her plotting to remove him from power, that she was never loyal to him, but still loyal to the Hasmoneans who opposed him. So he actually executed his own wife, who he seems to have loved. Beyond that, he also executed some of his sons. So the sons that he worried were plotting against him or too close to the Hasmoneans, he actually executed sons as well. So you get a sense from the ancient historians that this is a man willing to do anything, certainly to murder infants in Bethlehem. If he's willing to murder his own sons, he's willing to murder other people's sons. Octavian has a great way of saying it. When he reflects on the character of Herod, he says it is better to be a pig in Herod's house than a son in Herod's house. It's a pun on the Greek words for son and for pig that are very similar. But he's also making the point, as a would-be Jew, Herod won't eat pork, although he probably does. But he sees him, Octavian's referring to him as a Jew, who's opposed to the eating of pork, but more than happy to slaughter his sons. You get this image of Herod, particularly as he ages, that he becomes more and more mad. The historians also talk about before his death, he rounded up a prominent number of Jewish leaders because he knew that the people would celebrate when he died. He knew that upon his death, there would actually be rejoicing, which he hated. So he rounded up, or gave instructions to round up, these prominent Jewish leaders, and he gave orders that upon his death, all of them were to be slaughtered so that there would be weeping and wailing in Jerusalem upon his death. Now, the Jews don't actually carry this out upon his death, but it gives you an image for the kind of madness, the kind of fear and anxiety, the jealousy, the desperate control of power through violence that characterizes Herod the Great's rule. And that's certainly the image we get of him with the wise men and the murdering of the innocents in Luke's gospel that I quoted from, or Matthew's gospel that I quoted from in chapter 2. Herod the Great will die in 4 BC. In the Luke videos, I did a little bit of discussion on the dates around Jesus' birth. So even though Herod the Great dies in 4 BC, Jesus is probably born sometime before that, 6, 5, 4 BC, so just before his death, which again fits that picture of Herod's deterioration at the end. And Herod the Great will die while he is still ruling. He dies from a very painful death that seems to have caused more madness in the last days. Literally, Josephus says that he attempted several times to commit suicide with even kitchen utensils because of the pain, as his flesh was literally rotting. And so he loses himself and begins issuing these imprisonments for his children, these death sentences for prominent leaders. And there becomes a sort of question about who is the one to succeed Herod, as his sons are sort of kind of afraid to claim that even while he's alive. So ultimately, upon Herod's death, which is another one of these key turning points because it shapes the New Testament world, you get a dividing of his land into 3 primary kingdoms. So Octavian in this time period had become emperor. He honored Herod's will that Herod's descendants would rule, but the kingdom would be divided into the regions of Judea, Samaria, and Idumea. So this is the land of Jerusalem, as well as Samaria to the north, and then Idumea, which is kind of to the southeast, that it would be ruled by Herod Archelaus. Herod Archelaus is one of Herod the Great's sons. Then you also get the regions of Galilee and Perea. So Galilee and Perea will be, in this map, they're in the pink. So up around the Sea of Galilee and then to the east, what is modern Jordan. That these would be ruled by Herod Antipas. Both of these will become important in the biblical story. And then to the north, Iturea and Peneus, these will be ruled by Phillip, which will be a little complicated because Herod the Great had more than one son named Phillip. We'll look at in a moment. But these 3 tetrarchs, these 3 sons of Herod the Great, will basically divide up his kingdom: Herod Archelaus, Herod Antipas, and Herod Phillip. Like the previous Hasmonean timeline, you may not even be able to read this, let alone be able to memorize this. But this is a chart of the descendants of the Herodian family. So you have at the top Antipater and his son Antipater that ultimately leads you to Herod the Great. And then out of Herod, we begin all of this series of marriages. So you have Doris, then you have Mariamne, who we talked about. Out of Mariamne, you get a series of sons. I mean, you can see, and then Herod the Great goes on to marry several other women. So he marries a second Mariamne, he marries Malithus, he marries a Cleopatra, not the Cleopatra, but another Cleopatra. I mean, this goes on, and he bears sons from several of these women. It gets confusing because often they share names, and even as this family goes deeper, there will be some intermarrying within the family that can make it complicated as well too, although that's fairly common amongst these rulers. So what I want to do is I want to try to simplify it and just show you the Herods that are mentioned in the Bible, the Herods that are important for reading the Bible. And those are really these 5 Herods. So Herod Archelaus, Herod Antipas, Herod Philip II, which will not to be confused with Herod Philip I, we'll talk about in a moment. And then these are not sons, but grandchildren, Herod Agrippa I and Herod Agrippa II, that will show up in Acts. So a brief summary on each of these Herods to help you kind of understand them and position them in the New Testament story. The first is Herod Archelaus. Archelaus took over, as I said before, the area of Jerusalem and Samaria and Idumea, and his rule did not last long, only a couple of years. He was pretty chaotic as a ruler. He was given a reputation for violence, that when rebellion broke out, he would often use violent tactics to try to suppress it. It becomes a period of real chaos. I mean, at one point, one of his servants claims to be the rightful king. There's a son that he executes who later on appears to be alive but turns out to be an imposter. I mean, it becomes this period of just chaos around Jerusalem. And so Caesar Augustus eventually will depose Herod Archelaus from power, and he will put a governor in charge of Jerusalem and Judea. This is how we're going to get to Pilate in just a moment. But Herod Archelaus did not play a prominent role, although he does show up in some New Testament passages like Matthew chapter 2. Matthew chapter 2 records, "But when Herod died," we're talking here about Herod the Great. Remember, this is Mary, Joseph, and Jesus fled to Egypt because they received word from the Magi that Herod was seeking to kill the child. "So when Herod died," this is Herod the Great, "behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, 'Rise and take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel. For those who sought the child's life are dead.' And he arose and took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea," that's exactly what the historians tell us happened, "in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there." Why? We understand why, because of the chaos of Archelaus' rule. "And being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee." This is the reason Jesus will grow up in Galilee instead of Bethlehem, is because of the chaos in this time period of Herod Archelaus and his rule. As I mentioned, when Herod Archelaus is deposed in 6 AD, Samaria and Judea will be named a Roman province and given a series of Roman prefects or Roman governors. This is the list of them that take us through those mentioned in the New Testament. I'm not going to read all of them to you, but I'll point out a few important ones. Of course, we get Pontius Pilate, who becomes one of these governors that will intersect with the gospel stories of Jesus' crucifixion. If you continue in that line of governors, you will ultimately get to Felix and Festus, who are both mentioned in the book of Acts. So these Roman governors come to power because Herod's son, Herod Archelaus, had been deposed by Rome. That brings us to our next of those tetrarchs, the next of the sons of Herod the Great, Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas was far more effective than Archelaus and remained in power, and most of his time he spent trying to regain influence and territory that his father had had. And he does play a prominent role in the New Testament stories in a couple of places. So in Matthew 14 we read, "At that time Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus." This is Herod Antipas the Tetrarch. But again, what I mentioned before, sometimes they just appear as Herod, right? You have to know where the story is taking place. And in this case, it's Herod Antipas heard about the fame of Jesus. And he said to his servant, "This is John the Baptist. He has been raised from the dead. That is why these miraculous powers are at work within him. For Herod had seized John and bound him and put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother, Philip's wife." Okay, we've got some name drops we'll have to work on. "Because John had been saying to him, 'It is not lawful for you to have her.'" Herod Antipas will also show up in Luke 13. "At that time when the Pharisees came to Jesus and said to him, 'Leave this place and go somewhere else, Herod wants to kill you.'" Well, which Herod is this? This is Herod Antipas. So why is Herod Antipas afraid that Jesus is a reincarnated John the Baptist? What was the issue between Herod Antipas and John the Baptist? And how does it get us access to some more of those Herodian names? Well, this is where we get mention of Herodias and his brother Philip's wife. What John the Baptist had opposed in Antipas is that Antipas had fallen in love with the wife of his brother. Not Herod Philip II, who was one of the tetrarchs, but another brother, Herod Philip I. Antipas had fallen in love with her, she had fallen in love with him, and they made an arrangement to divorce their spouses, and she had come to the land of Israel to marry Herod Antipas, which John the Baptist had spoke out about because of the legal prohibition in the Old Testament against divorcing and marrying your brother's wife while your brother is still alive. He saw it as, rightfully so, it had been forbidden in the law, and he began to speak publicly against what Herod Antipas had done. And so ultimately Herod Antipas had arrested him, and then because of his wife had beheaded him. And so we get the story that's recorded in the Bible of John the Baptist's death. Then we get the story of Herod Antipas mentioned at the end of Jesus' life. So those two passages relating to John the Baptist are from early on. But as you keep reading, we get Herod Antipas turning up again at the end of the gospel story. So from Luke 23, when Pilate, who is Roman governor over Judea, heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him over to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at the time. So what's Luke recording? That this is a really fascinating passage because it gives us not only the history, but the land that matches up what the historians tell us, like Josephus, that whenever Jesus in Jerusalem is brought before Pilate, Pilate learns that Jesus is a Galilean. And what does he say? If he's a Galilean, then he's under the rule of Herod. He just calls him Herod here in Luke 23, but he's talking about Herod Antipas, who had been given rule over Galilee and Perea. So as a Roman who's trying to understand this complex Jewish religious question about Jesus' identity, Pilate sends Jesus over to Herod Antipas, who happens to be in Jerusalem for the Passover, because he wants to get the opinion of Herod Antipas, since Jesus is technically one of his citizens. The very last sentence here says, "And Herod and Pilate became friends with each other that very day, for before this they had been at enmity with each other." That something of this sort of sharing or reference to each other's power and rule, how they handled the Jesus situation, becomes a source of bonding, or at least an improvement in their relationship. So Herod Antipas becomes an important figure, John the Baptist, but also in the trial and the decision about Jesus. Then we get Herod Phillip II. Herod Phillip II had been one of the sons. We just talked through two Herod Philips, but the Herod Phillip II, the son of Herod the Great, who became one of the tetrarchs to the north. He does not play a prominent role, but we do get mention of him. So in Luke chapter 3, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, those are both mentions we've looked at, Herod, tetrarch of Galilee, so this is Antipas, his brother Philip, tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Licinius, tetrarch of Abilene. So basically what Luke is doing in chapter 3 is he's grounding us in the rulers of the period. So he goes on, the high priest Annas and Caiaphas, the word of God came to Zechariah in the wilderness. Did a whole video on this passage, but he's specifically telling us these are the rulers ruling during the period. Who are they? Pilate over Judea, Herod Antipas over Galilee, and Herod Philip, the tetrarch, over Iturea and Trachonitis. So we get a mention of him, although he doesn't play a part really in any of the stories of the New Testament. That leads us a generation later to Herod Agrippa I. Herod Agrippa I is an interesting character because he is directly related to Herod the Great. So I put on the screen here, if you remember Mariamne, Herod's second wife who was executed, we talked about that. She had a son named Aristobulus who was also executed. But before his son, Herod Agrippa I, could be executed, he had been sent to Rome, and he had primarily grown up being educated there in Rome. And so because he was there, he was spared, basically, the madness of Herod the Great, who would have been his grandfather. So he grows up, and this is important, right? He's the son of Mariamne's son, Aristobulus, which puts him in that line of the Hasmonean royalty, the Jewish royalty. But he's also Roman educated and Roman connected. So he's sent to Rome and raised in Rome, which saves his life. But there's a question. He holds no real claim to the throne because his father had never held any position. But his grandfather was Herod the Great, and he comes from this Hasmonean line. And so Agrippa I moves back and forth between Judea and Rome and really has relationships or claims in both places. But ultimately, it's his friendships in Rome. Having grown up there, he becomes friends with the emperor. And so as he has these prominent relationships, he's later in life able to use them. And he will be named the tetrarch of Philip's region to the north of Galilee. For no other reason than he knows the right people and he gets the position. So he arrives in 38 AD after Jesus' death and resurrection. This is beyond the gospel period, but a part of the story of Acts. And later he begins to, because of his effective rule and because of his influence with Rome, he gets more pieces added to that rule. He will eventually rule over Judea and Samaria, which makes Agrippa I one of the largest, since Herod the Great, one of the largest rulers, Jewish rulers of the area. There is, in fact, actually a very short period of time where he actually ruled more land than even Herod the Great had. Although we don't read as much about him because he's more in the story of Acts than in the story of the Gospels. He does show up, though. So in Acts chapter 12, we read this. It was about this time that King Herod arrested some who belonged to the church. This is King Herod Agrippa I. I said it was confusing because they're often just called Herod. intending to persecute them. He had James, the brother of John, put to death with the sword. When he saw that this met with approval among the Jews, he proceeded to seize Peter also. This happened during the festival of unleavened bread. So Agrippa begins to persecute and arrest prominent Christians in the book of Acts. Why does he do it? This fits with what we know from the ancient history. He's trying to appease the Jews. He's more aligned with Roman power. He's the descendant of Herod the Great. So he's trying to please the Jews to secure his power over those Jewish lands. We also read a really famous scene from Acts chapter 12 in which we get a depiction of Herod I's death. And it's interesting, we get this in the Bible, but you also get it in the ancient historian Josephus, who records it as well. But in Acts chapter 12, we read, "Then Herod went from Judea to Caesarea," that's that city on the sea that Herod the Great had built, "and he stayed there. He had been quarreling with the people of Tyre and Sidon, and now joined together and sought an audience with him. After securing the support of Blastus, a trusted personal servant of the king, they asked for peace because they depended on the king's country for their food supply. On the appointed day, Herod, wearing his royal robe, sat on his throne and delivered a public address to the people. They shouted, 'This is the voice of a God, not of a man.' Immediately, because Herod Agrippa I, did not give praise to God, an angel of the Lord struck him down, and he was eaten by worms and died." Now, Josephus records the same image, but Josephus says that these royal robes he was wearing was actually a kind of armor made of metals, silver. And whenever he stepped up before the people and began to speak, the sun shone off of his armor so that it seemed to make him glow in appearance. And it's this image that leads the people to say that he is like a god, an image of a god. Josephus records actually the box that it happened at in Caesarea in the amphitheater. If you ever go to Israel, one of the places, I think it's one of the top tourist attractions, is Caesarea. It's remarkable. You can go to the amphitheater. You can actually sit or stand in the box where this was said to have happened. And on his death, all of his power, his province, his control, it all reverts back to Rome, and they basically give it to the Roman governor in Syria who's already ruling. So it's a really interesting moment, although it does not play a significant role in the New Testament story. Herod Agrippa I, because of his Roman connections, was able to amass for a short period of time really all of the glory of his grandfather's kingdom. But upon his death, Rome immediately takes back control over that into the governor of Syria. So we also have descendants from Herod Agrippa that become important to the biblical story. Herod Agrippa I had the children Herod Agrippa II, but also the daughters Bernice and Drusilla. Drusilla will actually become married to the Roman governor Felix that we talked about. And these three are an interesting image. They're going to show up in the book of Acts, but there's also all sorts of salacious stories about them. Questions about the relationship as brother and sister, allusions of incest. They become really sort of, how do you describe them? They're sort of celebrities, or, the rich and the famous. And so they play a role. They're influentially connected because of their father, Herod Agrippa I. They will be given some right to rule, some power, but nothing like their father before Agrippa. And they seem to basically kind of move around marrying and trying to find influence where it is given. And you get this from the scene in Acts 25. I'll read it to you and we can discuss. A few days later, King Agrippa and Bernice arrive at Caesarea to pay their respects to Festus. Since they were spending many days there, Festus discussed Paul's case. Paul has been arrested and being held in Caesarea. And, Festus, as a Roman governor, is not quite sure what to make of the whole situation. And so whenever Herod Agrippa II, who is connected to Rome through his father, but also has this Jewish ancestry and seems to understand Judaism, Festus wants his opinion on what in the world's going on with Paul and what they should do with him and what the Jews have against him. He said, "There is a man here whom Felix," so that's the governor before, "left as a prisoner. When I went to Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews brought charges against him and asked that he be condemned. Then Agrippa said to Festus, 'I would like to hear this man myself.' The next day, Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp and entrance to the audience room." This is very characteristic of the image of them, sort of always elaborately dressed and sort of celebrities again. They came into the room with the high-ranking military officers and the prominent men of the city. At the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. Festus said, "King Agrippa, and all who are present with us, you see this man. The whole Jewish community has petitioned me about him in Jerusalem and here in Caesarea, shouting that he ought not to live any longer." So you get this great scene in which Agrippa II plays this role, hearing the testimony of the Apostle Paul himself, and yet sort of mocking the idea of being converted, that he would become a Christian just from hearing this criminal case. And that will be the last of the Herodian family that we will hear about in the Bible, although, again, a pretty minor role for Herod Agrippa II. That's been a lot of rulers. What we've done is we've basically gone through all the intertestamental period, talking about rulers from the period of Herod the Great through the Hasmoneans and the first of the Herodians, the Herods that came to power. And then I've tried on the end tack on at least a little bit more about each of these individual Herods. And again, I want to make the point I made at the beginning because I think it's so interesting. Each of these rulers plays a really critical part in the biblical story in that they shape the world of the Bible, the culture of the Bible. These turning points become really pivotal in the biblical story. But as you notice, they're never actually the main characters. The story of the Gospels, the story of Acts, is often about how they're persecuted or how these rulers flex their power. But in the end, who are the people the biblical story is about? Jesus, a Galilean, the Apostle Paul, who's held in prison, Mary and Joseph, a Galilean family on the run from these leaders and their tyranny. But in the end, their stories are the ones that are remembered. I mean, I bet before this video, you might not have been able to differentiate the Herods. You certainly couldn't have articulated the list of all of the Roman governors. In their day, those were the people that mattered. But isn't it interesting that 2,000 years later, most of us know nothing of their history, but we all know the history of Jesus. We all know the identity of Mary and Joseph. These are the stories that get recorded. So it's an important piece of learning for the background of the Bible. It helps you read the Bible and better understand what you're reading. But it's also important because it gives credibility. If you compare the ancient sources like Josephus, the Bible is remarkably accurate in its depiction of these leaders and their territories. It's grounding that story in actual history. But perhaps most important is it makes the broader point: this is not where the real story is. The real story is never just in the kings and the rulers and the breaking news headlines of our day. The real story is often that overlooked story, those people on the edge story, the forgotten, the arrested, right? The gospel going forth, even amongst these powers, these rulers seeking to oppress it and silence it, that's the story that's ultimately told. I'd love to hear your thoughts, questions. We did a 30,000-foot overview of a lot of history and a lot of rulers, but hopefully it gives you a good summary for in between the Bible and those rulers in the world of the New Testament.